and I commend this bill to the House.
The question is the motion be agreed to. Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and follow on from the Minister on this bill which has been brought before the House, and I want to say up front that I appreciate the time that the Minister gave to me personally to give some extra background details on the bill and how he foresees it working. And we've already said, Mr Speaker, that Labour will support this bill to Select Committee, but we said at the very beginning that we feel like there are some inconsistencies with different forms of treatment of fraud, and that we wanted to see whether or not this was an opportunity for us to even up that playing field, and that's something we will pursue through the Select Committee process. But I think when debates like this, Mr Speaker, it's always important to set out from the outset the general principles and values that you want to apply before then setting out the way that you're going to anticipate the policy working. First and foremost, we would like to get on record that fraud, wherever it exists, is wrong. Bottom line, no dispute. Fraud, wherever it exists, is wrong. And as the Minister has said, and I agree, fraud within the benefits system is also particularly destabilising, because fraud in that system undermines the entire system for those who need it most, and therefore that is why it does need to be weeded out. Equally, it then tars other clients with a very unfair brush, as does an individual who doesn't fulfil their obligations to try and seek work. That then tars other people with an unfair brush, as does a minister characterising people in the system in an unfair way. And I think it would be disingenuous not to imply that there are times in this House where people who access government support through genuine need and legitimate reasons are unfairly portrayed. And so that is why we treat these issues with a lot of caution, and we seek members that they treat fraud across the board in an even-handed way. And it's for that principle that I've already outlined that we see it as important. On that, in that regard, Mr Speaker, fraud, when it exists in our tax system, must also be pursued, because just as fraud within social security undermines the system for everyone else, fraud and tax evasion undermines the principle that we all have a collective responsibility to contribute to the ability to run this nation, to build the roads, to build the schools, to build the health system, all of those universals that we consider so important. But not all fraud is treated equally. But why shouldn't it be, Mr Speaker? If we're saying that on principle they both undermine a system, then surely we should be treating them equally. But there are provisions in this bill that won't apply across the board, and yet they are lowering a threshold, the test for prosecution. And so that's why we want to ask that question. Why are we not treating them the same? There are some differences. Scale is one of them. As I've said, fraud everywhere should be pursued, but there is certainly a gap in the amount that's being pursued, or at least our success in prosecuting and reacquiring money that is lost through tax evasion and fraud. Just a comparison, 39 million in the benefit system. It's more like 1 billion as an estimate within our tax system. So this is certainly an area we would like to hear a bit more of a public conversation from the government on how we can do better in that area. Don't drop either. That's not what we're saying. But why when we've had 2 debates now on fraud within the benefit system, and we haven't had one on this other area where there is so much more work to be done, Mr Speaker, and that's something we implore the government to do. I have heard it argued, though, that it's unfair to compare benefit fraud and tax fraud and evasion because, you know, tax evasion is evasion. It's not fair to strictly label that as fraud, but it is fair to say that that exact thing has been happening with some of the announcements that the Minister has been trumpeting. Not so long ago we heard him point out that great swathes of fraud, he'd said, that had been uncovered as a consequence of IRD sharing information with MSD. Now, the issue is that not all of that necessarily was fraud. Some of it indeed will be. But some of it is just highlighting the blatant inefficiency of our system, highlighting where there had been overpayment. Now, why was that? Well, because a large number of people who are getting government support are actually in work. They're just not earning enough to survive week to week. And so their earnings are topped up with a benefit of some description. Now, in order to make sure that someone who's working different hours every single week is not being topped up by too much or too little, they are required to call work and income at the end of each week, usually a Friday, and say, these are the hours that I have worked. Now, the issue is that, as anyone will know who's worked in somewhere like a supermarket or a fish and chip shop like I have in the past, I didn't always get my pay slip at the end of the week telling me the hours I'd worked. I would carefully take down what I thought I had done, but they weren't always necessarily the same thing, and that's what's happening with our work and income clients. They're calling based on what they know, but sometimes they're in precarious seasonal work with fluctuating hours and fluctuating overtimes and changing rates, and they're not always giving the correct details to work and income. Now, when work and income then go and do that data match, they find that sometimes there are indiscrepancies. Now, when at various points we've had up to 20% of our sole parents in part-time work, we're not talking about a small group of people where this potential error can take place. So all I ask from the Minister is the next time he does a data matching exercise, rather than standing up and trumpeting the amount of fraud he's weeded out, perhaps we could talk about the fact that not all fraud is deliberate. Some of it is the inefficiency of our system, and can we address that? Can we address the fact that I have work and income clients who come and tell me that work and income found it so difficult to manage their...
Point of order, the honourable member Sam Lutuin. Sorry?
Thank you. I don't mean to interrupt the member, but she's clearly getting away from the contents of this bill. And you're allowed to go a little bit away, but for 2 minutes now she's been talking about...
Order. Member, be seated. I'm on my feet. All contributions will be heard, and the member is making some valid points, and it's a debatable issue. This is a wide-ranging debate. It's the first reading. I call the honourable member Jacinda Ardern.
Mr. Speaker, that intervention just demonstrates that the chair of the Social Services Select Committee doesn't understand the driving forces between overpayment and what has been characterised by his government as fraud, and that if we want to fix the amount of time that is wasted by the Ministry of Social Development pursuing overpayment, which is sometimes confused as fraud, then these are the issues we need to deal with, Mr. Speaker. So I would hope that we'll have a little more enlightenment by that side of the House during this debate. Otherwise, we're going to miss that actually in some cases we're targeting the wrong issue, and it's a very valid point to raise in the context of this bill. And I am sure that the officials will talk about the fact that they spend a lot of time trying to filter between overpayment and fraud. And, Mr. Speaker, that is the issue I was speaking to. So getting back to then those, once MEC have gone through that process of then trying to, once they've seen the indiscrepancies, trying to then filter out which is which that they need to then go and pursue. It is an issue around the amount of effort then that goes into relative to some of the other areas of fraud that we have within our system. One of the things, though, that we do want to accept on this side of the House, relationship fraud, it probably represents a significant chunk. And it is fair to say there will be cases, and we're certainly aware of them from the side of advocates, that some women in particular are left carrying debt from relationship fraud that actually should be apportioned across two individuals who knowingly partook in that fraud. We also must acknowledge that some women are in relationships with a particular power dynamic as well, and we need to be mindful of that. Some women also have threats made against them that if they do not fraudulently claim these benefits, that their well-being is at risk. All of these things we have to take into consideration when we consider that this bill will amend Social Security Act 1964 and will enable a lower threshold for prosecution of partners of relationship when they're being involved in relationship fraud, by saying that they can be prosecuted when they ought to have known that fraud was taking place. So the test has been lowered. Now, our question is, Our questions, it's very difficult to prove if someone ought to have known something versus whether they did. It is, and so we're going to test that out at Select Committee. It's something we need to look into in more detail. But our question is, if you're willing to say that someone who's committing relationship fraud ought to have known that fraud took place because they benefited from it, because there was more money coming into the household, why couldn't you say the same for white-collar fraud? If someone's benefiting from white-collar fraud because more money is coming into the household, why is it that a spouse in that case will not be liable for prosecution? That is the kind of question, when I talked about the principles of treating fraud even-handedly, those are the kinds of questions we will be raising at Select Committee, and I hope the government will take those queries seriously.
I call the honourable member, Visata Sam Lotu Ainga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Talofa lava.
Talofa lava, and good afternoon to you and